Salt of the Earth Farm Stories is proudly brought to you by Grig Media.
I've heard farmers talk about where they used to spray red-legged earth mite in their pastures for years and years, and once they started doing re-veg on their places, had these little sanctuaries for all these little insects, they don't bother doing it anymore because there's enough biological control in the system to manage those earth mites.
Biodiversity on farms. This one gets really intriguing. In today's episode, I sit by a creek with Dr. Mason Crane to talk all things biodiversity on farms. We dive into how the landscape may have looked pre-European settlement, the role of dingoes, and how kangaroo numbers are now a modern problem. Along the way, we're joined by some feathered friends like the reed warbler. And Mason shares his thoughts on biological control and how a decent biodiversity can boost wool, milk and lambing production by up to 20%. Stick around for this fascinating chat with Mason on the past, present and the future of farm ecosystems. Good morning, Mason.
G'day, Darren.
Mason, we're sitting here in one of your creeks. It's very quiet. There's reeds, it's healthy, the water's clean. There's lots of birds going off their heads. It's a nice spot to be.
Yeah, no, it's special when a creek's allowed to do what it's supposed to do and have reeds and grasses amongst it. There's some revegetating trees on the edge. They can be really special places on farms. You get high bird diversity because where all the productivity is in these sort of dry landscapes across the southwest slopes. It's a place where you'll get the highest possum density if you've got big old trees and hollows. And then you've got all that freshwater ecology, which is sort of forgotten by a lot of people. But there's a whole new world in there in healthy streams and healthy waterways.
And just as we approach this little waterway, we had a really exciting moment happen. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, this little creek here, it used to dry up most of the time, but it's been fenced off for a long time now where there's reeds and rushes and grasses here. The ponds have started to form and get deep, and fish species have started to come back in here. Some of it's been carp and that sort of thing. But what we just seen then was some Murray River rainbow fish, which is a very exciting fish. You know, they like that grassy, wet floodplain area, and often they're pretty eruptive after floods, but then they disappear because most of our waterways get grazed back to nothing because that's where the green feed is. But in here where the grasses and reeds are allowed to grow and meet the water and grow into the water, it's perfect habitat for those Murray River rainbows, and hopefully there's other fish in here too.
And these little ones just here, they're beautiful to look at. They're about 3 inches long, just swimming peacefully.
Yeah, they're like little neon fish. They're sort of a neon blue with a red tail. That's the males. The females are a bit duller. And hopefully they're breeding in there now. I'll have to have a bit of a look to see if I can see any baby ones.
So Mason, can we go back a few hundred years and can you tell me how this landscape would have looked and how biodiversity played a vital role in our ecosystem?
Yeah, well, this landscape here in the southwest slopes, we're near Gundagai. It's pretty productive farming country, most of it. So that means it's sort of deeper soils, rich soils. So really good for growing grass. And in the lower parts of the landscape, it would have been dominated by grass and just a few scattered paddock trees. They talk about on the river around Gundagai when the first whitefellas come there, they documented that the floodplain was covered with kangaroo grass, you know, up to the shoulder of the horses. And then the gum trees actually only grew on the old flood runners or on the river itself where there was a bit of disturbance and they had the ability to grow. So the grass itself probably suppressed tree growth, and also probably some of the burning done by the Wiradjuri people that lived down there may have also suppressed the tree growth as well. But mostly grassy until you start to get the rises, slight rises, and then you start to get more trees until you get up to the rocky areas where it was lots of trees and shrubs, a lot more shrubs. So it would have been a mixture of open box woodlands and to more denser trees up on the hills. However, there is a range that runs through here called the Honeysuckle Range, which is serpentine woodland. Or serpentine is a geology, it's once an underwater volcano. Really dries dries really quickly out on the surface. It has a lot of heavy metals in it, so can cause toxicity in some plants. But it was described as a serpentine barren by Charles Sturt, one of the early explorers that went through here. So there's some places where there would have been treeless hills or very shrubby hills with the odd tree. There's a threatened ecological community called serpentine woodland, which grows on this range from Kulak to Tumut, and has a few unique plants on it.
Quite a unique area. But then comparing to a couple of 100 years ago, we had to move forward, didn't we, and feed our country with the growing population, and we've cleared a lot of these grassy woodlands. Is it right, I think, that there's only about 4% of the original woodland vegetation left?
Yeah, well, particularly things like white box woodland or yellow box woodland, while there might be scattered paddock trees and tiny remnants that still persist, less than 0.05%, I think it was quoted as, is in reasonable condition. And that's because while we might have the trees in some places, we've lost that understory. So the understory of these woodlands would have been very rich in wildflowers and forbs and grasses. In a lot of places you should be getting 20 or to 30 or more species within a 20 by 20 metre area in healthy boxgum woodland, but it just doesn't exist where you've had a long-term history of grazing, particularly set stocking, which sort of eliminates most of those forbs and probably reduces some of the dominant grasses like kangaroo grass that would have been there once, or some of the poa grasses, and it's sort of replaced by grasses like microlina, red leg grass that can chuck up seeds anytime, where a lot of these other grasses seeded once a year, and if it was grazed then it had no opportunity to seed again till the next year.
So this is because farming has become more intensive with modern trends and technology?
Yeah, well, even the early impact of just having set stocking or grazing had the really big impact. And that was probably a bigger impact than the clearing itself. It's just that everything was grazed and grazed heavily. The intensification of agriculture, which is probably the main threat to these landscapes now, is seeing some of the relic vegetation like paddock trees disappear, and some of the modified native grasslands that might be in some of these paddocks start to disappear. Cleaning up of the fallen timber, which is a vital habitat. I guess that's the main threat to some of these systems now.
And what about feral animals?
Feral animals, well, I guess earlier on the rabbits would have been the big impact. Not only did they defoliate or get rid of all the vegetation, but the methods that we used to control rabbits would have had a massive impact on any wildlife that would have existed there. So try to imagine any bit of long grass or habitat was considered harbour for rabbits. So all the poles of wood were burnt, any hollow log on the ground was burnt, any bit of long grass was grazed down or burnt, any burrow or rocky crevice was filled in or netted up with wire netting, and then pretty indiscriminative baits and poisons were used to kill them out, including poisoning water holes to kill the rabbit. So that would have also killed wildlife. So the impact on any wildlife that was still hanging on with all the extra grazing and clearing that was happening would have been smashed. And then, but with rabbits also comes the foxes.
Yep.
So with lots of rabbits, you can have really high fox numbers and cat numbers, and they would have been a big issue on the wildlife as well. There's actually a scientific paper done on the extinction of the kangaroo rat, which is based on the Rural Lands, or the PP Board at the time's records. When the dingo was first exterminated from a lot of these areas, it unlocked all the small, medium-sized mammals, so things like bettongs, bandicoots, and them sort of things really erupted in numbers, and it freaked out all the pastoralists and croppers of the time, which there's actually an article in the Pastoral Times, I think that's like a Deniliquin paper, talking about what have we done getting rid of the dingoes. Now all the small bush creatures are wiping out our pastures and crops. So there's actually a bounty put on bettongs.
Really?
Well, they just called them kangaroo rats, so they could have been any small
Yeah.
marsupial. So that was all recorded, how many of them bounties come in, but it wasn't till the bounties, the foxes started coming in, that the kangaroo rats started to decline. So they were surviving all the big sheep numbers and that sort of thing, but the final nail was the fox that come in.
And I suppose too, we've put a lot of water points in, and that allows our native animals to breed up too, such as the kangaroos.
Yeah.
And they're going to hang around for longer and eat out areas, aren't they?
Yeah, so I guess it's more of a modern problem now, because I think you talk to some of the old blokes around here, to see a kangaroo was a bit of a novelty, and they were sort of out in the bush blocks. I guess probably 60 years ago or longer, most rural workers had their roo dogs, and roos actually supplemented the food supply for them and their dog and all the working dogs. So if they seen anything, that was often caught or shot. But there wasn't many kangaroos. Over the last couple of decades, we've done more revegetation, planting trees, let bush recover in some places, which creates good habitat for kangaroos. We've got lots of watering points through this landscape, and naturally do, just with creeks and that sort of thing. Have all that pasture there. With the extra tree cover, you've got protection from wedge-tailed eagles for the kangaroos, and then we also don't have that humans hunting kangaroos as much anymore, like it was done a few years ago. And the numbers have built up, so now we've a lot of areas that have been set aside for conservation, or even people that are trying to manage their pastures in a more sympathetic way by letting them recover. Every kangaroo in the neighbourhood just gets onto those places and can cause as much overgrazing as livestock can.
Yeah.
So it is an issue. How we deal with it, I'm not sure. Like, you can cull kangaroos, but it does seem like a waste. There is chillers out there that harvest them, but they don't always do that.
But hundreds of years ago, I guess they'd go to a water point and they would just take what they needed out of that grassland and then move on. Whereas now they can hang around a water point, can't they? And
well, I guess there's two things that have happened. One is we don't have dingoes anymore.
Yeah.
So dingoes would have hunted the kangaroos, so they're probably uncomfortable hanging around waterways, like they found with what's happened over in places like Yellowstone, where they've brought the wolves back. That there's that landscape of fear now. There's places where they're meant herbivores don't hang around as much anymore.
Yeah.
So it's probably similar to that. And then we also don't have, whether it be Aboriginal hunting of kangaroos or the early white fellas that moved out here that hunted kangaroos for meat, you don't have that pressure anymore.
No. So can we start with now, what is biodiversity?
Well, I guess biodiversity, or bio, is living things, and diversity is the number of different species, even the genetic diversity within species. So bio is just the diversity of life, I guess, in a landscape.
And how about biodiversity on farms?
Yeah, well, when you think of biodiversity on farms, a lot of people just think of the native stuff, but there is exotic life also on here, which is all part of the system, whether they be rabbits or foxes or cats or pepper tree like we're sitting under here, or some of the native exotic grasses that we have. That's all part of the biodiversity, and I guess trying to find a balance where we can maximise the number and particularly save some of the unique biodiversity, which is our native stuff, is the challenge.
So how do woodlands play an important role in protecting our biodiversity?
Well, the woodlands, I guess, refers to the treed part of the environment. In agricultural landscapes, it was mostly dominated by woodlands and grasslands rather than forests. Like, forests are often not really good agricultural land, but our woodlands were the prime areas. So when early pastoralists moved down through these areas, they would have seen open woodlands, which were dominated by grass, so they would have seen it as good grass pastures for their stock. They would have seen it's probably easier to clear because there's not as many trees. And then they would have recognised certain tree species sort of indicated the more productive parts of the landscape. So white box and yellow box trees would have indicated that this is good farming country, so we'll concentrate on clearing those areas.
Is biodiversity and these woodlands under threat?
Yeah, definitely. There's, believe it or not, that I think biodiversity is improving across the southwest slopes. Well, some elements of it definitely are. Like a lot of the small woodland birds are responding well to the revegetation that we've done, the more sympathetic land management that we've done. But at the same time, a really important part of this landscape, the scattered paddock trees, which are the big old hollow trees, are starting to decline, and the trees that we planted even 50 years ago still got another 150 years before they're going to start producing hollows like them big old paddock trees. So on one hand we're seeing some biodiversity improving, but on the other hand we're going to start seeing a lot more, some species decline that rely on those big old trees.
So the box gum grassy woodlands are amongst our agricultural land, and they are home to many endangered plants and animals. Can you list a couple of those?
Yeah, well, species like I guess the squirrel glider, superb parrot, Regent honeyeater, which I don't think I've even actually seen one in the wild, although they do pop up every now and then. A lot of these species are primarily found in the remnant woodlands that exist on the private land on farms. Very few of them are found in the national park systems, and if they are in some of the national parks, they're on the fringes. Most of our national parks and reserves in this landscape were the land that was not suitable for farming, so they were left either for forestry or just were never cleared because they were so unproductive.
Yep.
But things like squirrel gliders and superb parrots need the productive parts of the landscape, and that's why they're only found on the private land. But I think for a lot of farmers, they see squirrel gliders or superb parrots as something important to them, so people are using that as a bit of a flagship species to motivate them to do some sort of re-veg on their place and protect trees.
And some of these treed areas amongst this agricultural land, they must come to life at night time. If you just bother to spend an hour or so in that one spot, you notice a lot, don't you?
Especially if there's big old trees, and some of the places where you get the highest density of big old trees are on the stock reserves or some of the road reserves around the place. And there's some places where within 200 metres you might have 5 to 6 brush-tailed possums, 10 ring-tailed possums and 6 or 7 squirrel gliders just within a 200 metre by 50 metre corridor along a road. That's amazing. And then when you have that, then you get the barking owls that predate on the possums start to come in. And but the hollow trees are really important for that side of things. But in the grassland areas, there's still other things. There's like your quail, there's insects and cicadas and that sort of thing. If you go a bit further west, you'll get fat-tailed dunarts on the flatter country out there, which you'd think there's nothing there, it's all grassland, but they emerge out of the cracks in the soil and go out hunting insects amongst the grasslands, and a number of different nocturnal reptiles too will come out overnight.
Well, just before we started recording, I think you listed off 6 or 8 birds that you could hear just in a few minutes.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting down here in this creek. It's sort of just with the increased number of reeds, a bit of re-veg around it, and the more permanent pools of water. That's a Cleberus reed warbler.
Is it?
They're just called then.
Do you want to try calling it up?
Okay, we'll see how we go. It's not the reed warbler, but a white-plumed honeyeater coming.
Perfect.
He's just above us here now. I think the reed warbler, he's checking us out, but he's not doing much. He's just lurking in them reeds, sort of peering around the leaves to see what's making that noise.
I thought I heard a little noise in there.
Yeah, but just sitting here while we've been talking, the superb fairy wrens calling in there, that little grass bird, golden-headed cisticola, and both those two, golden-headed cisticola, reed warbler, and the little grass bird. If we didn't have the reeds and down on this creek, you just wouldn't have them 3 species. That's what they're responding to. Oh, just as we got here, there was a spotless crake cackling away in there. And there could be other things in there. Sort of, I guess wetland areas is not great human habitat because it's very thick and dense, and we don't see much in there, so you have to rely on what you can hear.
Yeah.
And there's probably a lot more things going on in there than we can appreciate just sitting here.
So how do we define biodiversity in the context of farming, and why is it important?
Well, there's a lot of reasons why biodiversity is important, especially in these farming landscapes. Like, we need pollinators. So if you're growing lucerne or canola and you want to produce seed from that, making sure that you've got pollinators in the system is really important. Like, even to the point where some farmers pay beekeepers to put their bees out there to make sure there's enough pollination to produce a good amount of seed for when you're growing lucerne seed or whether it be canola. The landscape next to this area, which is just a lucerne paddock, you're going to have issues with lucerne flea, red-legged earth mite and that sort of thing. And if you've got areas here that are not grazed all the time and still have a good number of predatory mites and spiders and that sort of thing, they can quickly respond to outbreaks of pests.
Naturally.
Yeah, naturally. So often I've heard farmers talk about where they used to spray red-legged earth mite in their pastures for years and years, and once they started doing re-veg on their places, had these little sanctuaries for all these little insects, they don't bother doing it anymore because there's enough biological control in the system to manage those earth mites.
How good's that?
Oh, it's great. And, and probably without them not spraying all the times in the paddocks, probably creating a bit of resilience in those paddocks as well, because every time you spray, you're not just killing the pest, you're killing all the things that control it as well.
And also from a shelter point of view, stock can do a lot better.
Oh yeah, well, creating a good environment for the stock, whether it be clean, cool water, shade, protection from the wind. In many studies that have done show that you can get up to around 20% gains in whether it be wool production, live weight gain, milk production, increase lambing, lamb survival rates. And this is all because of environmental factors, whether it be from reducing the amount of wind, hitting your small young lambs at certain times, or enough shade so your cattle have somewhere to cool down and they don't have to use all that additional energy to cool their bodies or to warm their bodies. And the same with wool growth and that type of thing. Like, it's so important. There is some studies out there, it's probably not studied as enough as it should be, and it's something that people forget about, I think. Like, everyone's looking for the new genetics that's going to increase their production, or the new chemical that they can put on their place, or increase fertiliser, or a new vaccine or something that's going to increase their production. But I bet you none of those things will increase your production by up to 20%.
That's fascinating. Earlier you said about sheep too, just by being able to cool their bodies or keep their bodies a little bit cooler during the day, especially for wool sheep.
Yeah.
And sometimes they won't cool their bodies at night time if it's a hot night. So they're going to be stripped of weight.
Yeah, so I guess them extreme events, that's when you have, I guess, more dramatic consequences to the health of your livestock. So, for instance, in a heat wave period where the nights aren't cooling down, the stock can't cool their bodies overnight, so their temperatures staying elevated, they won't be eating, and it can have huge reproductive impacts on them. Like, it can cause abortions in pregnant ewes, it can cause infertility in rams if their body's kept too hot for too long. Another extreme event could be in a farm dam, like with an algal outbreak because it's not managed well, or creek line where you get blue-green algae outbreak. Most of the time it's probably not a big issue having a bit of algae and not very good water, but as soon as you have one of those, you can lose half a dozen cows with in one event just from blue-green algae poison. It might be rare, but those sort of things have big impacts.
Well, that 20% growth is fascinating, really. Well, that's a wrap for today's episode. We've had a great chat with Dr. Mason Crane about the importance of biodiversity on farms, production and a healthy environment, and how small changes can have a big impact. Next week, we're back with part 2, where things get even more fascinating. We'll dive further into the balance between biodiversity and farm production, and how farmers are crucial in maintaining a healthy environment. We'll also talk about the pressure from environmental markets, the carbon footprint in agriculture, and the magic that happens when habitats mix. Plus, get ready for some quirky and unexpected off-the-wall questions. Also, I'd love it if you could follow us on Facebook. Search Salt of the Earth Farm Stories. But in the meantime, keep your hands dirty and your spirits high.